Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pestana. And we're here today with special guest, Dr. Daryl R. Tongeren, and he's here to share with us his new book, Humble, Free Yourself from the Traps of a Narcissistic World. So Dr. Daryl R. Tongeren is an associate professor of psychology at Hope College. He is interested in deep and enduring questions about the human condition. As a social psychologist, he employs experimental research to investigate meaning in life, religion and identity, and virtues. So welcome to the show, Dr. Daryl R. Tongeren.
Thank you for having me.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this new book. What inspired you to write it?
So originally I had started doing research in graduate school on forgiveness, and a lot of the work we had done focused on how people forgive in ongoing relationships. And what we were finding was that by and large, the people who were forgiven most and the people who had the best outcomes when it came to forgiveness were people who could own up to their mistakes, the ones who took responsibility, the ones who admitted when they were wrong, and the ones who were remorseful. And to us, that just seems like humility. And so we started conducting study after study on humility. And after about 10 years, it just felt like it was time to summarize all the work that's been done in this area.
So, is there a broader description of humility that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I'd like to think about humility in two ways. The first way I like to think about humility is it's our ability to know ourselves, to check ourselves, and go beyond ourselves. So to know ourselves, it's an awareness of our strengths and our limitations, the things we do right, are areas where we excel, but also the areas where we can grow and we have some limitations. The second is to check ourselves. So to rein in some of those selfish motivations we have, to share the praise and accept the blame. And then finally, to go beyond ourselves, to consider the needs and prioritize the needs of others as equal to our own. But maybe a different way of thinking about humility is being the right size in a situation, not too big, which would be arrogance, but also not too small, which would be servility. So we want to be the right size, matching our expertise to any particular situation.
So, what are some of the benefits of humility?
Research is pretty clear that the benefits of humility are far and wide. First, there are benefits in our social relationships, and this is perhaps the strongest area. We realize that we want to be friends with and date people who are humble. When our partner is humble, we have longer and more committed relationships. We're more satisfied. We're more likely to forgive and repair the relationship. And overall, the relationship quality is higher. We even do better navigating stressful transitions like the transition to parenthood or persistent conflict and disagreement in a relationship. A second benefit is humility is good for your health. So research has found that there are physiological benefits to being humble. When you and your partner are humble, you can navigate the harder times of life better. We also see that humility has benefits at work. A lot of people tend to think that humility and leadership don't go hand in hand, but dozens of studies have found that the best leaders are the ones that are humble, the ones that can counterbalance strong ambition with a sense of humility. And that turns into higher productivity, less stress, greater creativity, and better employee health at work.
So, you have quite a bit I want to unpack there. I know you've done so much research. So, when we look at humility and how it really impacts our health, what does that look like?
Yeah, so some of the things that we find is, like I mentioned, if two people are both humble, so you and your partner are both humble, whenever you're navigating a particular discussion, disagreement, situation, there's a greater likelihood that you and your partner are going to experience less stress, less anxiety, but also cardiovascularly, you're going to have a better stress response. And you imagine why this would be the case. If you and your partner are both humble, you're willing to listen, you realize that you're both looking out for each other's needs, and you're not fearing that one person's going to be manipulative or steamroll or dominate in a particular setting. But we also realize that there are health benefits in terms of seeing the world more accurately. So one of the biggest struggles that people have when it comes to their mental health is an inability or unwillingness to see the world and themselves accurately. We have a number of different cognitive distortions that can keep us from living a full and flourishing life. But when you're humble, when you have an accurate awareness of who you are and an objective awareness of the world around you, you're less caught up by some of these cognitive distortions and more likely to live a flourishing life.
So, in your book, you talk about how humility transforms the four hallmarks of ego centered relationships. And I'd love for you to dive into that for our listeners.
Yeah. So, you know, when we're thinking about egocentric relationships, when we're thinking about relationships that are characterized more by narcissism and by a desire to look out for oneself, really humility just turns that on its head. And so instead, what we see is relationships that are marked by listening. So relationships where people are more likely to go out of their way to ensure that they hear their partner's perspective rather than uh, rather than defend their own perspective. We also see that in such relationships, we want to make sure that we focus on forgiveness, right? So we forgive our partner when our partner lets us down. We forgive our partner when they when there's conflict, and so we seek feedback, we're curious, as opposed to the toxic conflict of an egocentric relationship. Humility focused relationships are based on security, on trust, authenticity, seeking intimacy and self-disclosure, whereas egocentric relationships are untrusting, they're overbearing, they're guarded, and they avoid authenticity. And finally, humility focused relationships are centered on growth, where people are open to new ideas, where they change in light of feedback, whereas egocentric relationships are stagnant, people are unwilling to grow, or they're stuck in a behavioral pattern.
I know you did some research on this. I'd love to hear about it in regards to people have a choice. Would they choose someone that's humble, or are they looking for someone more arrogant?
Yeah, one of my first studies on humility, we designed a study that looked like a dating profile study. So we had people write up a dating profile for themselves, and then we showed them a few fake dating profiles. And one of the ones that they got was someone who's either humble or arrogant. And you can imagine on a lot of these dating websites, even on Facebook, people go out of their way to center themselves, make themselves look kind of a little bit more narcissistic, a little bit more showy. But what we actually found was that time and again, people were more likely to want to be friends with and, in fact, want to date someone who is humble relative to arrogant. In fact, not only did they like this person more, they were more willing to want to share their phone number with this person or even meet this person outside of the experiment. So for us, that said, there's something powerful about humility in relationships. And other work has found that in brand new settings, we're more likely to want to become friends and be part of a group with someone who's humble relative to arrogant. And then when we're in an ongoing relationship with somebody and we feel the stress of long distance, we're more likely to forgive that person. And it helps ease some of the relational wear and tear if our partner is humble relative to being arrogant.
So, a little bit ago, you talked about how humility helps us at work. So, how do we get to a place where we're exhibiting humility?
Yes. So, a lot of scholars have kind of started to delve into the importance and value of humility at work. So Jim Collins talks about level 5 leaders. So these are the leaders who are hard driving, but they're also humble. And really, it's a great way of counterbalancing having high, lofty goals. And it can kind of take some of the sting out of some of the hard driving ways that business and industry can tend to operate. But if we're thinking about how do we cultivate humility, the first place we have to start is we have to seek feedback. We have to find a valued, trusted source in our lives, someone who's going to tell us honestly how we're doing in terms of humility. And we have to ask them to give us honest feedback. And perhaps we get this feedback from a number of different relationships and in different contexts. Maybe I'm humble at home, but I'm kind of a jerk at work. Or maybe I'm humble at work, but on the pickleball court or on the tennis court, I'm a little bit arrogant. And so we want to get a complete picture of our humility. The second thing we want to do is once we get that feedback, we want to make sure that we accept the feedback instead of defending ourselves and claiming all the ways that we are humble. Once we have that, once we have the feedback and we're not defensive, one of the things that we can do is start cultivating empathy. And what that looks like is seeking other people's perspectives and trying to see what it's like from their point of view, as well as attuning ourselves emotionally to how they might be feeling in a particular situation. And so one final thing to realize is that in our culture, in many cultures, the moving sidewalk moves away from humility and towards narcissism. So if we do nothing, it's going to be easier and easier for us to act narcissistically and harder for us to act humbly. So if we commit to acting humbly, we have to do so every day, realizing that it's going to be a process that requires constant practice.
Well, just like anything, it requires practice, you know? You don't become a
That's right.
master of it overnight. So
That's exactly right.
well, and I wonder if people who are high achievers or have lots of ambition, is there a fear that they think that if they become humble, that it would actually have a possibility of dampering their ambition?
I think that's right. I think that a number of people who are high achieving, people who might be high on perfectionism, kind of ambitious folks, they think if they don't hold themselves to an incredibly high standard, then maybe they won't be successful. But the truth is, all of us fail. At some point or at some time, we fall short of the goals that we set for ourselves or the standards that other people have set for us. And so sometimes in those situations, what's best is for us to embrace our own limitations, to realize that to be alive is to have limits, to have to be bounded, to not be able to do everything or even everything perfectly. And so once we realize that humility can free us from some of the traps of seeking our worth and our value from external sources of worth. When we shift from trying to become the most successful, the richest, the most beautiful, the most interesting, and instead we find a sense of security in ourselves, not from other people, that actually is a sense of security that can free us to live a life according to our values and could actually allow us to live a life in which our ambition is able to be realized rather than hampered by humility.
It's like a reassessment of our values to, how you're saying how align with I guess who we are really wanting to show up in the world as.
That's exactly right. Because a number of times what we do is we tend to compare ourselves and we compare ourselves at our worst with other people at their best. And we're always going to find people who outperform us in some dimension. And if we put our worth in their hands, if we put our value in the contingencies of others, we're going to continually feel anxious, alone, disappointed. And instead, humility shifts that and it shifts our worth to a sense of security in which we know that we're already loved, we're already enough, we're already worthy.
Now, it seems that it would be easy to have humility and offer forgiveness for people that we love and care about, but how do we cultivate that for people that we don't know?
Ah, right, exactly. And see, this is where it's the hardest, but I would argue it might be the most important. So, humility really is important for helping us bridge divides, for connecting with people who are different from us, maybe people with whom we don't actually get along. And I think the crux to all of that is empathy. And empathy really unlocks not only humility, but a lot of other virtues that are important in a flourishing life. And so, again, empathy is really trying hard to imagine what someone else might be thinking in a situation, giving someone else the benefit of the doubt, seeking to see their perspective and imagining that they might be trying their best. And although that's incredibly hard, one of the things it does is it humanizes the other person. We sometimes can gain empathy by thinking of times we've let other people down or times when we have fallen short and hurt other people. And when we can rest in the humility of knowing that we too are not perfect, it can soften us to other people and open up our eyes to see their perspective.
It's amazing how much of that is a shift in perspective, but a lot of it is, it sounds like, is also the willingness to look.
Right. And for any number of reasons, we can be defensive and we can be unwilling to do that work. I think that work is hard. That work inherently acknowledges that we might be wrong about some things, which we don't tend to want to admit. And so it does come a bit down to will, to desire, and to the motivation to want to improve in this way and try to connect with others from whom we differ.
Are there pitfalls to being a humble person in a relationship?
Yes, so there are some pitfalls to humility. So, we tend to think about humility as one of many virtues you could deploy. It's not going to solve all of your problems. In a relationship, you might imagine that a pitfall of humility would be if you happen to pair up with someone who just isn't ever humble, right? Who doesn't actually want to be humble. And if you're the one that's always giving and the other person isn't, you might find yourself feeling resentful. You might feel taken advantage of, and you might sometimes feel manipulated. And so, in such situations, It's important to make sure that you have good, strong boundaries as well. Humility is not being too small, as I mentioned before. It's not servility. It's not giving up who you are for the sake of a relationship. You would always want to make sure that you maintain your own values, your own sense of identity, and make sure that your needs are being met, not only the other person. So, one pitfall in relationships is when you're paired off with someone who's far more arrogant and unwilling to try to be humble because you can risk exploitation.
Well, it seems we have a lot of people who fall into the people pleaser kind of category anyway. So I think that this is allowing them to be humble, but also have boundaries regarding how they're humble.
That's right. And humility, like I mentioned, is not being too small. It's being the right size. And so for some people, the humble response is to right size down. So for those of us who maybe think too highly of ourselves or too arrogant, being humble means reeling ourselves in, right sizing down. But for folks who have been historically overlooked or marginalized, or they come from groups that have historically been oppressed or overlooked, it might mean right sizing up, living into your expertise, making sure you don't shrink in a situation. Sometimes people think of humility and they think that word can be used to make sure other people stay in their place and they don't act out. But that's not authentic humility. Humility is the security that comes from embracing who you are, flaws and strengths, and being that right size.
So in your book, you talk about ambition and achievement. So how does that play a role in all of this?
Well, sometimes people think that if you're going to be humble, you have to give up on being ambitious, that you can't achieve things. But rather, I would suggest that humility is key to helping us meet some of our ambitious goals and to help us achieve. So many of the most important goals that we've ever accomplished as a society, as humans, have come by working together. And humility helps us work together with other people. It's a little bit like a social oil. So, in situations where conflict is high or there's a power differential, humility can help soften some of those dynamics and can allow us to work together to reach otherwise fairly difficult goals. Also, when we do achieve, when we have experienced a modicum of success, humility helps kind of reel us in from becoming too egoistic. And so we're quick to share the praise for our success. We realize we got where we were because of lots of other people, not just ourselves. And we're willing to accept some of the blame and not shirk that off into other people.
So let's say a company has a leader who is humble. How would his people on his team feel?
People really enjoy working for a humble leader as long as that humility is authentic. And usually, followers can suss out when someone is being inauthentically humble, and they respond very poorly to that. But for authentic humility, they in turn act more humbly. So humility is a bit of a social contagion. It spreads in a good way, of course. We also find that humble leaders are more likely to have more creative teams because people feel safe to share their ideas, knowing that they're not going to be criticized if their ideas aren't good or accepted. People are more likely to be healthier and less stressed out when they're working for a humble boss relative to an arrogant one. And productivity goes up. When you know that your boss has your back, you're more likely to work hard. So being a humble leader is a little bit like leading from behind. You're still in charge, but you're making sure that everybody is going along together and you're making sure no one gets left behind.
That sounds like the kind of workplace I think most people would enjoy being a part of, you know?
I hope so. That's right.
Well, and it's good to talk about that because there's so much shifting in the workplace today. So I know that people are looking at how they can be better managers or better bosses or make the workplace better. And to have this kind of key, I think is such a big deal.
Well, and that's the hope, right? Is as more people see some of the benefits of humility, they realize it's not a sign of weakness. It's not something that's going to make you a poor leader, or it's not somehow going to sacrifice your power. In fact, people are attracted to humility. So humility is a bit of a signal that lets other people know how they're likely to be treated when they're in a relationship with us. It's like a badge of trust. We trust people who are humble because we know that humble people are going to be looking out for us. They're just not in it for their own self interest alone.
Yeah, it's a little bit, I feel like they have a safe place to land.
That's right.
How do we cultivate humility, whether it's in relationships or at work? What are some of the starting points that we can use to start developing that now?
Well, once we realize that it's about knowing ourselves, checking ourselves, and going beyond ourselves, take some time, spend some time with some friends, and do an honest and thorough assessment of what are some of the things that you're good at, but also what are some of your limitations. And it's okay to own some of those limitations. For example, years ago, I signed up for a triathlon. My wife was signing up for a triathlon. I thought it'd be fun to train together. And so, a triathlon is a swim, a bike, and a run. Well, I signed up for a half Ironman triathlon, and what I kind of what came quick to realize is, well, I didn't really know how to swim, and so that's a pretty major limitation if you're signing up for a distance event where you're going to spend 1.2 miles in open water. And rather than giving up on the whole enterprise altogether, I found a coach, right? And I found a swim coach who could help me learn how to swim. Now, the short story of this is my wife was so kind and found me a triathlon swim coach. But when I say I didn't know how to swim, I mean I really didn't know how to swim, and he was not interested in teaching someone who had no basic knowledge of swimming how to swim. And so I got fired by the first swim coach, and I found out that I had to use a swim coach down at the local rec center, who was also the middle school swim coach for the local school here in town. And so it was a little humbling for a full grown man to have to get swim lessons from a middle school swim instructor when he's in his 30s trying to accomplish, his first triathlon. But that's a necessary acknowledgement I had to make. I have a limitation. This is a huge limitation. And if I ignored it, I could have just abandoned the triathlon altogether, or I would have had a really rough or dangerous experience trying to swim more than a mile in open water. So similarly, all of us have these limitations. We have areas where we're just not as good at something as someone else might be, or we just haven't developed that muscle, whether it's a social muscle or a moral muscle or an intellectual muscle, we just haven't developed it yet. And so once we realize some of our limitations, we realize those are growth edges and those are things that we can lean into. So I'd probably start with an honest assessment. The second thing I'd probably do is pay attention to when you're in situations and your first inclination is to make sure you are the center of the story, or you make sure that you get your praise and your attention. So because humility is about checking yourself, you want to kind of walk back some of those selfish motivations. Make sure that other people get a chance to share. Make sure you take interest in what other people are doing and what's going on in their lives. Ask questions. Listen. Listening is a huge way to convey to other people that you're humble and to really kind of cultivate some of that empathy. And then finally, go beyond yourself. A lot of people in relationships get so worried if they don't meet their own needs, no one will, right? That their needs will never be met. But if you're in a healthy relationship where you can share your needs and your partner reciprocates and listens to that, that can be so transformative. Being able to say, hey, here's what I need, and then helping meet the needs of your partner, it creates a mutuality. And who wouldn't want to be in a relationship where each person's making sure that their other partner's needs are being met just as their own?
In your book, you talk about radical transparency. What is that? And do you have a story to share about that?
So radical transparency is this idea that imagine what would happen if people just gave you completely honest feedback. Now, this is practiced by Ray Dalio. He's a hedge fund manager, and to differing levels of success. Maybe it's helpful, and in some ways, I'm sure there are probably some huge drawbacks in this. But if we can just put something like this to a small scale in our own lives, imagine cultivating with someone or a group of people just the blunt level of honesty, so someone could tell you radically how they feel about you, what they think about you, the degree to which you're being kind or kind of a jerk. What are the things you're good at? What are the things that you need to improve on? Often we're so worried about hurting each other's feelings, we don't tell each other the truth. But honestly, the truth is what we need to hear from each other. Some of the best things we can do is be honest with one another so we know areas where we can grow and we can work on improving our lives. It's kind of like having a friend who's good enough to let you know that you have a piece of spinach between your teeth, right? It takes some honesty. It takes a little bit of courage for them to tell you, but wouldn't you rather know? In the same way, what are the areas in our character where we quote unquote kind of have spinach between our teeth? Wouldn't we want our friends to let us know some of our blind spots? And so finding people, in a small group of people. I wouldn't recommend doing this with everyone. First of all, not everyone wants to know your unfiltered opinion, especially if they haven't asked for it. And second, you want to make sure that you have people that you can trust. So when they tell you what they honestly think about you, you know that they're not being motivated by some selfish impulse or some other reason. They really do care about making your life better. So it's this idea that we're going to share honestly with one another, even when it's difficult to do so, even when it hurts, and that we welcome that same level of transparent, honest, authentic feedback in return.
Does there have to be a certain amount of empathy involved when we're engaging in that kind of feedback?
Absolutely. We certainly would not want to share something with someone else maliciously or because we know that it's going to hurt them. We really want to tell them because, it's going to improve their life. So the first time I ever did an interview about humility was on a Friday. It was during the summer. I live here in Michigan, and one of the rewards for the long, cold, dark winters of Michigan is we have absolutely beautiful summers. And my wife and I live not that far from Lake Michigan. So I did this interview at 11 a.m., but I had promised my wife, hey, let's go to the beach. Let's go to the beach. And I had said we should leave for the beach at 11, but I still went ahead and took this interview. Well, I thought it was just going to be a 15-minute interview. It turns out to be an hour-long interview. And my wife is patiently waiting. She's packed the lunches for the beach. She's packed the sunscreen and the towels. She's ready to go. So when I finally emerged from our downstairs office an hour later, she's ready to go. But one of the things the interviewer had asked is, hey, as a humility expert or someone who studies humility regularly, are you actually more humble in your relationships? They were curious, whether it translated into real life. And so they said, can you ask your wife how humble you are? And so after keeping my wife waiting for an hour, not going to the beach, I come upstairs and I ask, before I even ask this question, I say, because I'm training for a marathon, which I was at the time, would you mind if you took all of our stuff to the beach, take the towels, take the sunscreen, take the lunch, take it all out to the beach, lug it all out to the water, and I'll meet you there because the beach is about 7 miles away. And well, I needed a 7-mile run that day. And so after keeping her waiting and then having the audacity to ask her to haul all this stuff to the beach, I say, oh yeah, by the way, the interviewer wanted to know on a scale of 1 to 10, how humble am I? And she said, how humble are you? Well, you're a 4. And come to think of it, at first I was shocked. I thought a 4, that's horrible. But after all I had put her through, yeah, 4 seemed pretty generous. And so it wasn't that my wife was being mean-spirited. It wasn't that she was even being inaccurate. At the time, that was a glaring display of selfishness. I had completely failed to appreciate all the ways that she had sacrificed and all the things that she had done. And in fact, I asked for more. And so she had empathy in that she wanted to give me honest feedback. She wanted to let me know right now is a moment where you've really missed the mark. And we've revisited that, and time since I've said, hey, I want to make sure that I'm improving. I'm getting better each day. I'm not going to keep on living kind of in that situation and putting myself in a situation where I treat you that way. And so empathy is key to that process. And when it happens, it can be pretty powerful.
So, how do we process feedback when we get it like that? Because that is honest feedback, but I'm sure your run was a very thoughtful run, right?
Well, the first thing I did is I did not go on that run. So I said, I realized, hey, let me skip the run. Let me go with you. Let me help you get that out to the beach. The way that our initial response oftentimes is to get incredibly defensive. And so we kind of huddle up, we put up our walls, we avoid, we don't listen. But really what we've done if we get really defensive is we've lost the opportunity to learn. And so sometimes you have to ride out that initial wave of defensiveness. So allow it to wash over you, resist getting defensive, stay open, and again, press in by knowing that the person is sharing this with you because they care. Now, it's not always the case. Sometimes people say mean-spirited things, but for someone that you love, someone that you trust and value, like my wife, she was really sharing it with me because she cared about me. She had something that she wanted me to know. I had to let that first wave of defensiveness wash over me. Another thing that we can do is when we're feeling pretty, defensive, it's usually because we're feeling a bit like our sense of meaning is under attack. So our relationship is feeling strained. Our way of making sense of the world is kind of upset, and so we can kind of reaffirm and kind of bolster other sources of meaning. So we can think about other ways where we're not letting our partner down. We can think about other ways of affirming ourselves, even when it feels like we're under attack. So the idea is to get through that first wave of defensiveness so you can be a little bit more open-minded.
So when we feel that defensiveness, is that like a clue for us to check in and see really what's going on?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So defensiveness usually comes because something that we love and something that's dear to us feels threatened, right? We feel like we're going to lose something. And so maybe in that moment, the reason why I felt defensive was I actually felt like I was harming the relationship that I cared so much about. And so, yes, we feel that defensiveness. What we need to do is press in. We need to ask ourselves, what is the threat? What's the core fear behind my defensiveness? And so a lot of times down deep, what we're worried about is losing something that we love. At the core of fear is a love. And I loved my wife. I do love my wife. And I was worried about harming that relationship. And that's why I was feeling defensive.
Well, I think that's all very insightful, and a lot of people can relate to that. We've all done something, including myself, where we're like, "Oh," and it's a lot of times we don't mean to be that, not unthoughtful, but it's a good marker to go, "Hey, I need to make an adjustment here."
Yes, that's exactly right.
So, in your book, you talk about adopting a growth mindset. How important is that, and why would we do that?
Because humility is in part acknowledging our limitations, sometimes people think, well, I'm just not good at fill in the blank. Whether that's like I'm not good at math, or I'm just not a good communicator, or I just don't share my feelings with others. All of those are kind of what we would call fixed mindsets. And fixed mindsets are when we feel like things can't change. And this is just how it's always going to be. But a growth mindset flips that on its head. A growth mindset says, well, maybe I'm not as good at communicating my feelings now, but I can be. Right? Maybe I'm not as good at math now, but with work, I could be. And so a growth mindset is critical to developing humility. It's critical because we realize that our limitations are just opportunities and areas for growth. That with some work, with some intention, it's possible that for us to improve some of these areas. I did end up learning how to swim. I did complete that triathlon. So I could go from someone who didn't know how to swim to someone who does, but it took work. But part of it was acknowledging that I could grow, I could change, and I could improve. And so all of that is critical when we're trying to foster humility, which requires us to acknowledge our limitations.
It seems like you had the right humble coach to work with you, right?
Yes, she was absolutely great. I mean, she was willing to coach some random stranger who was me, while she was also in a different pool coaching her middle school team. Yeah, and she humbled herself to kind of help me through that process. So she was great.
You gotta love that. In your book, you talk about empathy in action. I'd love for you to dive into that and tell us what that is and how we can cultivate that.
Sure. So empathy in action. So when we're trying to think about how to cultivate empathy, how to kind of put that into practice, really, we're kind of thinking about a number of different things. So one of the things that we had talked about is humility is a little bit about taking someone else's perspective, right? So it's about making sure that you're seeing the point of view of somebody else, right? Making sure that you are kind of going out of your way to consider the perspective of somebody else. A second thing about putting empathy into action is to try to tune in to the emotional needs of somebody else, right? So imagining what it might look like or feel like for them in a particular situation. And so, one of the ways that we can both hear someone else's perspective and emotionally tune is to make sure that we're quick to listen. So I think that empathy is kind of a glue for almost all of our relationships. And if we don't listen, right, if we just make assumptions about other people, we're probably not going to be very empathic. And so putting empathy into action means we listen first, we make sure we get the whole side of the story, And we give people the benefit of the doubt or we ask questions to clarify when we're unsure.
It really sounds like being so open-minded that we are listening to other people, like really active listening.
That's exactly right. To when they bring something up, to affirm, to make sure you're getting it right, and to let them know that you actually genuinely care.
I think that's so empowering. I was surprised to see that you talk about self-esteem in this book too. How does that intertwine with humility?
Yeah, so I want to dispel the myth that if somebody's humble, they have no self-esteem. Again, that I think that's kind of a misperception of humility. Self-esteem, I would say, is your evaluation of yourself, right? Do you evaluate yourself positively or negatively? At the end of the day, when you look at yourself, do you think, yeah, I'm a person of worth or value, or do you think that you're not? And so I think that people who are humble have a healthy sense of self-esteem. And by that, I mean their self esteem is based not on these external achievements or these contingencies that blow around like the wind, right? So if it's based on athletic ability, well, there's eventually going to be, even if you're the fastest or strongest person in the world, there's always going to be eventually someone who's faster or stronger. And as you age, you'll lose that. Or if it's based on how much money you make or how much prestige or power you have, any of those kind of sources of self esteem are so fragile. And so to me, people who are humble have a healthy self esteem. They have a positive view of themselves because it's rooted in reality. They know the things they're good at, but also the areas where they need to grow. And so for people who are worried that if they embrace humility, it means they think less of themselves, that's simply not true. It simply means having a self esteem that's more rooted and more secure because it's based in reality.
And not clicks and likes and all that kind of thing, more so in regards to who they are as a person, right?
That's right. So it's not, how many times have you been retweeted or liked or something has been shared? It's who are you as a person? That's exactly right. What are your values? How do you treat other people? Those things are more enduring than these fleeting standards of worth that we chase.
Well, in your book, you talk about how, you know, defensiveness is something that we're defaulted to. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. So they're looking at going, okay, well, how do I make the shift then where I look at things and I don't, or I get feedback and I'm not immediately defensive?
Right. So one of the first things they can do is exactly what they're doing right now, and that is to learn some of this, right? So an awareness is so important. And so because defensiveness is our default, right? Because we fear uncertainty, because we don't like not knowing, our defensiveness comes out in all these different ways. And so being aware of this defensiveness is key. So for example, our defensiveness comes out because we have a desire to be right. Usually what this means is we surround ourselves with people who validate our views. We also have a desire for certainty. So we want to know what's coming. We want to know what to predict, even though the world is incredibly unpredictable and we can't know it. And then finally, we're defensive because we kind of interpret the world in a way that confirms what we believe about the world already. And so, starting with knowing that defensiveness is your default is the first stop, and realizing that your first knee jerk reaction may not be your healthiest. So once you know that, the second thing you can do is you can slow down. And like you said, you can press in. When you feel yourself getting defensive, when you feel yourself arguing, or you feel your anxiety rising or your anger rising, slow down, press in, ask yourself, what am I getting defensive about? What's the core? What is the fear at the base of this? And then you can start shifting your perspective in such a way where you acknowledge your own limitations. You can say, you know what, I'm not perfect. And being perfect is an unrealistic expectation. It's possible I've hurt someone, that I've let someone down, that I failed to live up to a commitment that I had made. You acknowledge those limitations, and then you can take accountability, take responsibility for that. Own your mistakes. You'd be amazed how much is diffused when you own your mistakes and you say, you know what, you're right. I made a mistake. It's my error. I'll take responsibility for that. That just shifts a situation so much. It diffuses situations, and then people are much more likely to want to move forward and try to repair a relationship.
Do you find that there's like certain places where they kind of get stuck when it comes to developing greater humility?
I do, yeah. So probably what we would think of as some of our core beliefs. And so, it's all the things you can't talk about at a dinner party, like politics and religion, right? That's where people often get stuck. And so these are our core beliefs that are central to kind of how we make sense of the world at large. So these are beliefs that we hold, and we hold them so strongly because there's just so much at stake, right? So if you think about religious beliefs, especially religious beliefs about what happens to people after they die, you don't want to be wrong about that, right? I mean, those could be eternal consequences. So there's just so much at stake. People get unwilling or unable. They feel unable, but it's more likely unwilling to change some of those beliefs. And so anything that addresses what researchers call these core existential themes tend to areas where people really do get a little bit more defensive, and more humility is harder to practice.
I can see how that would all come together. I mean, you've done such great research for this book. When you were doing your research and compiling it, was there anything that really surprised you?
There were a few things. The first was I was so surprised by the sheer volume of research that's been done in the past decade. So when I set out to write the book, I knew that it was time to write a book on humility. It was time to get the science of humility out there and declare the importance of humility. But as you mentioned, there's just a lot of research. There's just scores and scores of studies. The second thing that kind of struck me was as I was doing the book and I was writing the book, I noticed that some of my own views started to shift a little bit. And one of a famous quote by William James that I really love is he says, "A great many people think they're thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices." And the way that I think that relates to humility is sometimes we think we're being humble just by shifting the target of our vitriol, right? If before we were really angry and spiteful at one group, but then we change and now we're really spiteful at the other group, we think, oh, we're so open-minded, we're so humble, we've changed, but we really haven't. And so as I was going through this book and went through this process, I think in a number of different ways and a number of different beliefs, I just became a little bit more moderate. I started seeing the value of both sides, if there are only two sides, and that's a bit of a false dichotomy. I saw the value of multiple sides, and I realized that on the extremes are a bit where people can get a little lost, where people can get a little bit too intense. And I learned the value of moderation.
All such wise things, wise in feedback and research that's been done here. It seems like we're just in this world that, especially now, that narcissistic tendencies and people they seem to get rewarded. So, how can we develop humility that for us is a that lasts and it's personal?
Yeah, and that is absolutely true. We are in a culture that seems, at least on its surface, to reward humility, or sorry, reward narcissism. And one way to think about this is when someone meets a narcissist, there's kind of that initial intrigue. So the narcissist comes into the party and everyone is looking at them and they're making a fool of somebody, dump the punch bowl on somebody's head and everybody's laughing. And in the beginning, that kind of seems fun. It seems intoxicating, but that charm and that appeal is very short lived, especially if you are in a long term relationship with that person. Because before long, you're the person that they're dumping the punch bowl on, right? You're the person that they're making fun of in order to inflate their own sense of self and their own ego. And so, although it seems like the world rewards narcissism, although it seems like that self promotion is exactly what people need, decades of research has found that this overly strong focus on narcissism has left us feeling more isolated, anxious, depressed, and mentally unwell than we've ever been before. And so, even while there might be small, kind of cheap reinforcements or rewards for being narcissistic, it just doesn't align with how we were designed as humans to be. Right? It doesn't align with our human makeup. And so, part of how we can start developing a lasting humility is by starting small and practicing. Pick a relationship where you really want to try to lean in and be humble and start doing the work in that relationship. Once you start finding that footing, start spiraling it out. If you started at home, try it at work as well, right? Bring it to your pickleball partner on the court, right? How can you start seeing? And then what you'll start doing is you'll start seeing the rewards of being humble. You start feeling the emotional and relational benefits of acting and living with humility. And over time, these fleeting and seemingly transient rewards of our narcissistic culture will lose their appeal, because what you'll realize is it's much richer, it's much more meaningful, it's much more fulfilling to live in relationships marked by humility.
Yes, instead of acts that serve one, something that serves all, I think ends up being much more um, just appealing.
Absolutely. How can we go from being me focused to being we focused?
And we definitely need more of that right now.
Yes, we do. We do.
So I know in your book, and we've talked to kind of touched on this a little earlier before, but it's you talk about humility as something that is habitual. So we could practice it. And is it something that we do every second of every day, or is it something we mindfully do? What would you say on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll be the first to admit it. For me, I have to keep trying to work at it, right? Because again, just the moving sidewalk moves away from that. And so, I think it's something that we set an intention for. It's something that we can connect with others, and we could try to hold each other accountable to work toward. You know, but it's one of those things where I think it's kind of like training for a marathon, right? So you wouldn't just go out tomorrow and run 26 miles. Maybe some people can, but most of us would need to kind of train up to get there. But we'd also have to put in kind of regular work, kind of consistent work, time in and time out, until it becomes a little bit of a habit. And so whether that's making it top of mind, and so kind of making an intention and making a commitment, and then each day just trying to be a little bit more humble than you were the day before, I think is a good.
Such a good place to start off from. What would you like readers to take away from your book?
I think a few things I'd like readers to take away. The first is to realize that humility is actually a strength. It's not a weakness. It's a way for us to engage ourselves, the world around us, and our relationships with authenticity, with honesty, and with a bit of empathy. So it's a strength. The second thing I would want us to embrace is anytime there is kind of widespread dis-ease or unwellness among people, it probably means that there's features of the culture that are just not suited to the people living in it. And I would contend that part of that is our narcissistic culture. And so we can do something to change that. We can be the change we want to see in our society, in our culture, in our relationship by living into that humility. We can start transforming it by the simple actions we make ourselves and the commitment we make to live out humility in our relationships. And then the last thing is you can just try to be a little bit more humble than you were the day before. Right. So some people think, oh, humility, this is such a daunting thing. There's no way I could ever do that. But I think if you just start small incremental ways in one relationship, in one exchange, and just build on that, like a snowball, over time, it'll grow and it'll become more habitual.
Well, Daryl, I've just really enjoyed your book, Humble. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work and be part of your community?
Yes. So, they can buy the book at local bookstores or on Amazon. They can learn more about me at darylvantongeren.com or on Twitter at drvantongeren, Instagram at darylvantongeren. I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to get feedback from listeners and hear the ways in which humility has helped transform your life.
Well, Daryl, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Daryl. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Humble: Free Yourself from the Traps of a Narcissistic World. Humble is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And remember to support our indie bookstores. If you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it for you. You can also purchase Humble at the publisher, theexperimentpublishing.com. And you can also learn more about Daryl and his work at his website, darylvantongeren.com. That's spelled DARYLVANTONGEREN.com. There you can check out his most current research that's been done, his publications, and also his other books, including The Courage to Suffer, a new clinical framework for life's greatest crises. And we're going to be talking about that in the near future. Well, on this note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.